Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have my January wrap up for you guys. So all of the books that I read in the month of January, I have a total of 11 books. That is significantly more than I originally thought I was gonna read. For some reason, I just ended up getting super hooked on reading this month, and before I knew it, I literally had read 11 books. This month was full of a lot of ups and downs for me as far as reading quality goes. I started off the month with an absolute banger. I was so pleased with the fact that this book was my first read for not only the month, but for the entire year of 2021. So I was like, okay, this is a good sign for how the rest of the month is gonna go. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Anyway, let me just get right into them. So the first books that I read this month were From Blood and Ash and Kingdom of Flesh and Fire by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I absolutely loved these books. Now, these are the first books I've ever read by Jennifer L. Armentrout. She's, from what I've seen, a very prolific author, but this is the first series I've ever read by her, and oh my god, I was just blown away. I absolutely loved everything about these stories. They were so much more complex than I actually thought they were going to be initially. Going in, I knew that they were romance books, so I knew that they were going to be spicy and steamy in that aspect, but I truly didn't expect the sheer amount of world building that went into these books. Like, it's kind of, I would say, equal parts fantasy and equal parts romance. And I think that I realized after reading this series that that might be the perfect mix for me, because I've said many times before, but I personally love the romance in whatever book I'm reading, typically more than anything else. So in a story like this where it's kind of equally important, I was just like, I think this might be my perfect series. Now, given all of that, you think that I would give them obviously 5 stars. In fact, I actually ended up giving them both 4.5 stars each. I was really torn on whether I should give From Blood and Ash 4.5 or 5 stars. I think the reason why I kind of held back on that last 0.5 stars is just because, I don't know, there was something slightly missing with it for me. I can't even tell you really what it is. It was just a feeling when I ended the book that told me that it wasn't a 5-star. Like, it's a very solid 4.5. So just to give you a little synopsis for what this story is actually about, because I just realized I've been raving and gushing about it, but I haven't even told you guys yet what it's actually about. Okay, so in this story, Poppy is the main character, and she is named the Maiden. So she's supposed to be very chaste, very pure, and very demure. She always wears a veil in public. No one except for maybe 2 people in the entire world are allowed to see her without her veil. But the thing about Poppy is that she doesn't actually embody that role, in the sense of her personality is the exact opposite of what you would imagine. She's extremely vivacious, she's super confident, she knows how to kick ass, and she literally makes no apologies for it. And Hawk is the main male character in this story. He's actually Poppy's bodyguard. So from the very beginning, they kind of have this really intense encounter before they even realize who the other person is. And then, you know, they end up working together or being together a lot because he's her bodyguard. So their relationship is very intense. I can definitely see how it might be too much for some people, like people who don't like relationships that literally are 100% all the time. And that's this couple for sure. Like, they can't look at each other without like totally thirsting over each other every single time. But as I've said before, this book is not entirely just kind of pointless romance. The world building in this book is insane. Like, I think because I wasn't prepared for it, I was kind of blown away by how much detail and information we were given about what was going on in the world. Now, I've also said this before as well, but one of my absolute favorite things with characters and relationships is when they have snarky banter. Like, it doesn't even have to be really good snarky banter, to be honest. Hawk and Poppy did not disappoint in that aspect. They are super snarky, super bantery with each other, and it is so amazing. Now, with Kingdom of Flesh and Fire, I was definitely a little bit more conflicted with this book. It was still a pretty solid 4.5 read for me, but there were definitely some more issues that I had with this book that I didn't really have with the first book. For one, this book is just angst central. Like, literally the characters are so angsty in this book, and I'm sure that that's a big draw for a lot of romance readers, but for me it was definitely a little bit of a struggle because I don't love a ton of angst, and there was a lot of miscommunication between the 2 characters, Hawk and Poppy, versus in the first book, I mean, there were definitely things that were concealed, but it wasn't an issue with miscommunication between the 2 characters. I felt like they were both pretty straightforward with each other. Maybe not honest, but they were straightforward, you know? And so with this book, it was really frustrating because there were a lot of romantic scenes that were happening even before they finally had a real honest conversation with each other. Like, I don't love the idea of like this kind of relationship where they were like willingly like, oh, let's just lie to each other. And I'm like, Let's not do that actually, because that's not great. But I still gave it a 4.5 because I still love the dynamic between these characters. I feel like this book just further confirmed my love and appreciation for Poppy's character. She is truly one of the most intelligent, resilient characters I have ever seen. And I'm super, super excited for the next book because I feel like she's only gonna get even stronger. And obviously I am here for all of the Hawk and Poppy content. Give me all of it because I literally can't get enough of this. The next book that I picked was honestly a book that I picked just because I knew, like, I could feel myself falling into a really bad reading hangover. So I forced myself to just pick up a very quick and easy book. It's Ruby Red by Kirsten Gier, and this book is originally translated from German. So in this story, we follow Gwen, who is a 16-year-old girl living in London, and she has a few quirks, like she's able to see and talk to ghosts, and she's actually able to time travel. Now, this is a gene that runs in her family, and so it was expected that someone in her generation would inherit the time traveling gene, but it was always expected that it was actually going to be her cousin. So her cousin, who's the same age as her, was actually groomed from like birth to be prepared to time travel, but the responsibility actually ends up falling on her. So she very quickly has to adjust to the role of being a time traveler and, you know, preparing for all of that means. There's also some big mystery that they are working on figuring out in this book that never really gets explained. And of course, a hot guy who is just thrown in as the male love interest because of course there is. And there's just a whole cast of very unlikable characters. So overall, I gave this book a 3-star rating. Realistically, it should probably be more like a 2 or something. There were definitely a lot of issues that I had with this book. For one, it actually ended up reading like a middle grade book to me. I still can't really believe that this is technically marketed as YA because the writing was so simple. And I know that it was translated from German, so I don't know honestly if it's related to that, but I don't feel like it's a stretch to say that this book honestly should have just been middle grade instead because there was nothing about it that felt YA. Now, the first thing that I always notice when I read any book that has any kind of time traveling or whatever in it is how different things would be if the character wasn't white. Now, I know that's obviously not the main point of most of these kinds of books, but obviously as a person of color, I can't help but notice that every book about time traveling, especially in YA, always has to do with white characters because no author wants to touch the subject of how different the experience would be for someone who is not white. So in the case of this book, in this story, the time traveling ability comes from an actual gene that is passed along in certain families. And yet I find it terribly interesting and convenient that not a single one of these people have mixed with a person of color at any point in any of these stories. The pacing as well in this book is super weird because I know that it's only a 300-page book, so they obviously have to cram a lot into it, but the pacing is like light speed. It's insanely fast. Everything develops in a matter of like seconds, and yet it feels like nothing's really happening. The main character is just thrust into this situation and they're just shuffled along into everything that, you know, is happening. So I'm pretty sure the whole thing is we have to read the rest of the books, the other 2 books in this series, to understand and get the whole picture of what's going on. But I feel like that's where they did a really bad job with the first book anyway, because nothing was explained. Nothing made sense. Nothing about this book was convincing. From the insta-love to the actual problem to the mystery to wanting to support and believe in these characters, like nothing about the story convinced me to do any of that. So yeah, this is definitely not a great read, but I think I will probably try to get the other 2 books in the series from the library when my library does open up again. I will pretty much always try to finish a book series once I've started it, unless there is some reason for me to absolutely despise it. The next 2 books that I read were gifted to me by a friend over Christmas. This is a book series that he really enjoyed, and so he thought that I would enjoy, and it's Serpent and Dove and Blood and Honey by Shelby Mahurin. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about these books, mostly not super positive because I didn't love these books, to be honest. I gave Serpent and Dove 3.5 stars and Blood and Honey 3 stars. So in case you don't know what this book series is about, I will just tell you very quickly. So the main character's name is Lou, and she's a witch. She's actually fled her coven, and as a result, she's not able to use her magic in order to stay hidden and under the radar, because aside from the actual witches from her coven that are trying to hunt her down, she's also hiding from witch hunters that actually hunt witches. So one day, because of this very specific incident that happens, she ends up having to marry Reed, who is actually I'm not even gonna try to say it. It's a French word that means witch hunter, but it's a chasseur. So she ends up having to marry him to protect his reputation, and she uses that as an excuse for safety, even though now she's living in a den of witch hunters, so I don't know how safe that actually is. And the underlying turmoil that's going on throughout this entire book is about a long-standing war between the church and the witch hunters and the actual witches themselves. If you couldn't tell from my reaction while summarizing this book, it does not interest me. Even the synopsis, when I read it way long ago when it came out, didn't interest me. To be honest, the only reason I read this book is because my friend thought so highly of it and he recommended it, and he actually bought it for me. So I was like, you know, it's not just gonna go unread sitting on my shelf. But I have to say that this book is probably the definition, like most textbook example of a fantasy YA story that I have ever read. There is nothing really spectacular or different about it at all. I know that this is Shelby Mahurin's debut novel, so, you know, I had to cut her some slack for that. But overall, there were a lot of things that I felt like weren't really done well, weren't really written well, or explained well. The only two parts that I really enjoyed out of this book were the things that Lou was saying, because Lou herself is not like a character that I really like. I don't think there's anything that special about her, but the things that she was saying, like, she's just very sarcastic and dumb. So the things that Lou was saying, as well as Coco. Coco was my favorite part of this book, and that's because Coco radiated big dick energy. Like, for sure, she should have been the main character of this book. If Coco was the main character of this book series, I feel like I definitely would have rated it a lot higher. The fact that she was just a side character and had a supporting role to Lou and Reed's story, I was just like, I felt like Coco was a much more compelling character on her own. Anytime Coco was brought up, like her magic, her backstory, anything, I was so much more interested in that than whatever Lou and Reed were talking about. So yeah, I gave this a 3.5. I don't know, even thinking about it now, I feel like 3.5 is a little high, but I'm gonna just stick with the rating because it was okay. The second book, however, this book was a huge departure from the first book. So where I said the first book was an incredibly standard YA fantasy, like romance, I guess, story, the second one tried to be just like a fantasy action story. So there were a lot of things that Shelby Mahurin attempted to do with this book, and they were all just that, attempts. So in the first book, where basically the main plot of the entire story is just Lou and Reed's relationship, this book actually tried to be like an action type adventure book, which is probably the reason why I think a lot of people were disappointed by this book. This book had a significant drop in ratings on Goodreads from the first book. I personally wasn't super invested in Lou and Reed's relationship in the first book, so I didn't mind that Shelby Mahurin was trying to go in a different direction with the second book, but I felt like it was executed really poorly, and it was an incredibly ambitious attempt for a newbie author. The only aspect of this story that I did enjoy was the realistic kind of depiction of Reed and Lou's relationship. So for example, in the first book, you know, Lou and Reed are going through their own issues of being a witch and a witch hunter and whatever. But in the second book, Reed really has to grapple with the fact that everything that he knew and that he was raised to believe is pretty much wrong. Reed was a much more compelling character in the second book than in the first book, where he was just a love interest, and now he's actually a character with depth. Again, I can definitely see why that would be a problem for fans of the first book, because they had gone from this couple where they had risked everything to be with each other and to protect each other, to suddenly kind of questioning those things and questioning themselves within that. So yeah, that was by far the most interesting and well done aspect of the entire book. There were a lot of points in this book that I could tell that I was meant to feel something, and yet not a single thing landed with me. And I felt the same way about the first book as well, especially with the climax of the first book. The way that she handles these dramatic scenes and these emotional moments, it just, something about it doesn't land. But despite everything, I am definitely going to still read the third book when it comes out, not because I am particularly interested or invested in the series, but just because the end of this book left with such a cliffhanger, and I'm just like, I'm gonna finish off the series. There's one more book. It's not gonna kill me to finish it. So the next 3 books that I read in the month of January are actually ebooks, and these were also recommended to me by the same friend who recommended Serpent and Dove to me. So I read the first book, and I actually ended up being interested enough that I read the rest of the books in the series that's currently out. So that's 3 out of 4 books, and it's the Horseman series by Laura Thalassa. And prior to reading them, I actually had seen them before on like TikTok and stuff. Basically, in this series, we follow the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as they have come to Earth to destroy and wreak havoc. So at the start of the first book, it's been 5 years since the horsemen first arrived, and then they left, and it's just been pestilence for the last 3 years. And the formula is the same for all 3 of the books. So in each of the books, one of the gods is roaming the earth doing their mission, and they come across a human woman who, you know, eventually dissuades them of their mission. So in Pestilence, the character is a character named Sarah Burns, and she is a firefighter. So as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, I can already tell the level of writing that I should expect for this book, because there's nothing more classic than having a romance main character be named something like Sarah Burns and having her be a firefighter. But anyway, I should have lowered my expectations significantly after that, but I was still shocked by how ridiculous the writing was at times. Like in the first book alone, there were so many times that I actually physically cringed from reading the book, because some of the things that the author chose to write and the way that she chose to write them, I just like couldn't handle it. And as I've said before, I do enjoy romance sometimes. I definitely know what to expect when reading these books, but like I was not prepared for the level of cringe for at least the first book. It definitely got better cringe-wise with the rest of the books. It just turned out that Pestilence is the most cringy character. Something that I definitely didn't love that they did with all three of the main characters was, first of all, made them all the same character with different names and different like backgrounds, but essentially they boiled down to being the exact same character. So each of the characters was just extremely crude. The first one made me really uncomfortable because I could tell that the author was trying to make her a strong, badass female character. She's a firefighter, she works with a lot of men, she's really strong, you know, she has a lot of opinions and whatever that makes her a feminist icon. But in reality, it was just the main character being crude for the sake of being crude. But I will say that despite everything that I just said, all of the complaints that I just mentioned, I still gave this first book a 2.5 stars. As for the second book, War, I noticed that the formula for everything that was happening was essentially the exact same thing. I admit to liking War significantly better than Pestilence, because Pestilence felt like a whiny little kid who was like starstruck with the first woman that he met, versus War, you know, he's had a little bit more experience, he knows people more. I was definitely a little bit more drawn to this story because he was basically the embodiment of one of my favorite tropes, which is the strong, badass male hot guy character who's actually a soft, fluffy guy and would absolutely bend over backwards and do anything for his love interest. But I think one of the main things with each of these books is that they're meant to be enemies to lovers, because none of the gods are particularly fond of human, and they don't obviously want to be in a relationship with a human, but they end up being suckered into them each and every single time. The only other thing that was different about this book compared to the other two books is that the main character actually had a female friend, which was really nice to see. It was so nice to have her have a relationship and a bond with someone who isn't the main male love character. That was one aspect that I enjoyed about that book. And then we get to the third book. By this point, I was pretty exhausted with this series. I had spent 3 days in a row reading these books, so every single day I read a new book. So by the third day, I was pretty tired. I felt like I knew exactly what to expect, and I was not really mentally ready for it, but I was like, okay, I'm just gonna finish this off. This is gonna be the last one for a while. Let's just get through it. So I read the third book, which is Famine, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that this one was very slightly different. So while most things stayed almost exactly the same, the main difference with this character versus the last ones was that Famine was actually a character that had suffered through years of abuse and torture, and that gave his character significantly more substance to his actual being. The other gods are just demigods who are on Earth to carry out this mission. Famine is also obviously here to carry out his mission, but now he has a personal stake in it because he was tortured and abused literally for years by these terrible human beings who just kept him locked up, and every time he would regenerate and heal, he would just be tortured again continuously. And so now we finally get a reason to understand and sympathize with this character. We finally get some real motivation behind their actions. And so I was like, yes, I can stand behind this character. Other than that though, almost everything was the same. The guy resisted against falling in love with the MC. He eventually fell in love with her, and then he gave up his ways and whatever. So in each of the 3 books, death makes a small appearance, but in the last one, Famine, he actually has a big part to play in the last few chapters. I am very, very curious to see how Laura Thalasso will finish off this series with that character. So the next book that I read for this month was another library book that I've had for about 2 months or so now, and it's a book that was randomly recommended to me, so I truly knew nothing about it going into it. I just looked up what people were saying about it on Goodreads and stuff to see if it seemed interesting at all, and I saw that it had LGBTQ plus representation, which made me very, very happy and excited to read this book, because other than that, it sounded like a very, very typical standard YA fantasy story. It's The Winter Duke by Claire Eliza Bartlett. I gave this book a 1-star rating, and it's actually my very first DNF for this year. I was definitely really bummed to see that my first DNF happened in January, but I really couldn't force myself to finish this. Like, as much as I was trying, it was like pulling teeth out. It was so torturous getting through this book. Now, I did DNF this at 50%, and I don't know about you guys, but for me, anytime I finish about 50% or more of a book, I will consider that still as being read, because I did still invest that time into the books. I don't think that I would DNF a book before that, because it wouldn't be like giving it a real fair shot, because maybe it does pick up later. So I wait until it gets to, you know, the middle of the book, because by that point, there should be something drawing me into it. And so if it doesn't by that point, then there's nothing that can save this read. But to just tell you a little bit about this book, the main character's name is Ekata, and she is 16 years old, and her father is the Grand Duke of a place called Kaima Above, and she's one of 13 children. So in this kingdom, any of the 13 children are able to inherit the dukedom. It's not by age or gender or anything like that. It only has to do with whoever shows the most power or something, the most strength. And Ekata is definitely not in the running to become the next duke, because first of all, her only interest is in science and biology, and second of all, she wants nothing more than to go away to university to get away from her family in the first place, because they're all very murderous. The way that a lot of dukes in the past have inherited the crown is by killing each other, and so even though there's 13 kids, they're constantly all trying to kill each other. So it's not one big happy family or anything like that. A curse befalls her family, and she's actually the only one that didn't fall under it for some reason, and now she's left as the only one to inherit the title of Grand Duke. And now she has to navigate through dangerous politics and complicated relationships in order to save her kingdom and her family. The pros of this book: this was a completely new world that was crafted from scratch, and everything about it was incredibly unique. I've never read another book with a similar kind of world. It was believable in the sense that it felt like there was a deep history to the kingdom. So for example, anybody of any gender can be basically anything. So even though typically you would think of a duke as a man and a duchess as a woman, there is only the Grand Duke and the royal consort. So the duke is like the highest person in this kingdom as far as I can tell, or is it a dukedom? I don't really know the difference. So for example, Ekata is now the Grand Duke, and she can choose a royal consort to be her like husband or wife, and it doesn't matter what gender they are. It just matters who they're attracted to or who they choose and what political gain they get from it. So yeah, that aspect was definitely really cool and unique and interesting to read about. Now for the cons, I would say everything else. This whole book was such a struggle to get through. It was so heavy and so daunting. It literally felt like I was trudging through quicksand. We're obviously following the perspective of Ekata as she's going through all of these trials and tribulations, and at the same time of inheriting the dukedom, she also has to figure out who the hell put the curse on her family, because magic does exist in their world, but it's very heavily monitored. So that's a whole thing on top of it. I was really hoping that the romance at least would save this book for me, but the romance literally was nothing. It started off interesting enough. It was very insta-lovey because she felt like she made a connection with this person that she had never talked to but made eye contact with across the stage. And yet aside from that, I literally got up to 200 pages of this 400-page book, and I could see no substance in the relationship. It was just very bland. So yeah, The Winter Duke, 0 out of 10, would not recommend. After that terribly disappointing book, I was a little bit afraid to start a new book that I wasn't sure if I was gonna like or not. So instead I turned back to a comfort read, a book that I knew that I was gonna enjoy and that I've been wanting to reread for a while, and that is Throne of Glass. If you're wondering why I have it here without the cover, it's because I think the covers are super disgusting and I never ever display them with the actual covers on. But anyway, that means that I started my reread of Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas, which is my all-time favorite book series, and I'm so glad that I did, because this book really saved my month. Even though I started off the month really strong by reading From Blood and Ash and absolutely loving that, if you can't tell already, the books that I read since then have significantly dropped in quality. I felt like I was going on a really bad downward slope for my books, so I wanted to pick up a book that I knew I would enjoy and that would hopefully save this mess of a month. If you don't know, Throne of Glass is about an 18-year-old assassin named Selena Sardothian. She, for the last year, has been kept and working as a slave at the Endovier salt mines, which is literally a slave labor camp. At the beginning of the story, she's offered a chance at her freedom by basically competing in a competition to become the king's assassin, the king's champion, and working her her debt off. So basically she would work as the king's champion for 4 years and then she would have her freedom. So she obviously takes that opportunity because anything is better than being a literal slave. And so the whole first book is about her going through this competition and the mystery of something else sinister that's going on in the castle. The last time that I read this book, I gave it a 4 stars. This time I actually gave it a 4.5 stars. So I did enjoy it a little bit more this time. And I think that's because this time around I was able to just enjoy the story and the details and nuances of what was happening more than worrying about what was the overall picture. It was such a relief to read this after reading The Winter Duke, and I realized that Celaena has been a girl after my own heart from the very beginning. From the first moment that she's introduced, I realized that there is not a single aspect of her character that I don't enjoy. There were definitely some things that I forgot about with this first book because the other books in the series get so much longer and so much happens in them. Like, for example, I forgot how much I was rooting for Celaena and Dorian in the first book. So yeah, this was an absolutely wonderful read. I'm so glad that I decided to pick this book series up again. The last book that I read for this month was Crown of Midnight, the second book in the Throne of Glass series, and I gave it a 3 stars. It is without a doubt the slowest book in the series, and I can say that confidently because a lot of this book is just setting up things that are going to happen in the rest of the books. Now, this is a 400-page book, and I can pretty honestly say that the first 200 pages of it are a little bit of a struggle to get through. Once I actually did hit that 200-page mark though, everything kind of just took off all at once. The action of the story finally came through. I actually ended up crying for a good portion of those last several chapters. Something happened to one of the characters that I absolutely love, and I obviously knew it was gonna happen, but it was no less devastating reading it all over again. And the worst part was reading everything from Celaena's POV because she was so devastated and heartbroken by everything that had happened that I just like couldn't control myself and just bawled my eyes out. So yeah, this was a definite 3-star read for me because half of the book was pretty boring. It's definitely not a book that I would reach for if it wasn't an integral part to the rest of the series. Okay, so those were all 11 books that I read in the month of January. It was definitely a bit of a roller coaster month for me because I started with a high and then it progressively went down lower and then it went back up towards the end. I'm super excited to continue my reread of the Throne of Glass series, and then who knows what I'll pick up after that. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I would love to know if you guys have read any of the books that I mentioned, or if you're curious about any of them. Let me know. I would seriously love to have a conversation about any of these. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Take it all for what it is.